Welcome back to another journey through history. Tonight, we're travelling to a Paris that most people have never truly understood. Not the Paris of romantic poets and sunlit cafes, though those existed. Not merely the Paris of jazz and champagne, though those flowed freely. Tonight, we explore the shadowed streets, the smoke-filled rooms, the hidden world where a pharmaceutical miracle became a social catastrophe. This is the story of heroin in 1920s Paris, a tale of medicine turned vice, of innovation corrupted, of a city caught between healing and harm. Before we begin this descent into one of history's most fascinating pharmaceutical disasters, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes these stories keep you awake, and sometimes they guide you gently into sleep. Either way, we're glad you're here. Now settle in, dim the lights, let the world outside fade away. We're going back to a Paris that smelled of tobacco and perfume, that echoed with accordion music and quiet desperation, where the City of Light harboured some very dark secrets. Part 1. A City Transformed. The Paris of the 1920s was a city reborn, but the birth was painful, traumatic, scarred by what had come before. To understand the heroin craze that would grip this magnificent metropolis, we must first understand the world from which it emerged. The Great War had ended only years before. 4 years of industrialized slaughter had consumed a generation of European men. France alone had lost nearly 1.5 million soldiers, with millions more wounded, maimed, disfigured. The battlefields of Verdun and the Somme had turned into graveyards that stretched beyond the horizon. Young men who had marched off singing patriotic songs returned silent, haunted, forever changed by what they had witnessed. Paris itself had survived relatively unscathed in physical terms. Unlike the northeastern regions of France, which had been reduced to muddy wastelands pocked with shell craters and littered with bones, the capital stood intact. Its grand boulevards remained, its monuments endured, the Seine still flowed beneath its elegant bridges. But the city was different now. Something fundamental had shifted in the soul of Paris. The war had shattered old certainties. The Belle Époque optimism that had characterized pre-war Europe, that faith in progress and civilization, had been blown apart in the trenches. How could one believe in the inherent goodness of humanity after witnessing the mechanical efficiency of modern warfare? How could one trust in social order after seeing empires collapse and revolutions erupt? Into this psychologically fractured landscape came a flood of people seeking something, though many couldn't quite articulate what. American expatriates arrived on ocean liners, fleeing prohibition and American provincialism, carrying trunks full of manuscripts they hoped to complete in Paris's creative atmosphere. Russian aristocrats appeared with little more than the clothes on their backs, refugees from the Bolshevik Revolution that had destroyed their world. Artists from across Europe gravitated to Montmartre and Montparnasse, drawn by Paris's reputation as the centre of the avant-garde. The favourable exchange rate made Paris affordable for foreigners with dollars or pounds. A modest income from home could support a bohemian lifestyle in France's capital. Apartments in the Latin Quarter cost almost nothing. Wine flowed cheaper than water. A meal at a local bistro cost centimes. For the first time, struggling artists and writers could afford to live in what many considered the cultural centre of the world. The city throbbed with creative energy. On any given night, you might find Picasso holding court at the Café de Flore, Ernest Hemingway drinking at the Dingo Bar, Gertrude Stein hosting her legendary salons, where the greatest minds of the age gathered to discuss art, literature, and the future of civilization. Jazz had arrived from America, bringing with it a rhythmic sensuality that seemed to capture the post-war zeitgeist. Josephine Baker danced nearly naked at the Folies Bergère, scandalizing conservatives and delighting progressives. The can-can still kicked high at the Moulin Rouge. But beneath this glittering surface, something darker churned. The same uncertainty that sparked creative innovation also drove people toward escape. The same freedom that allowed artistic experimentation also permitted dangerous indulgences. The same rejection of old moral codes that liberated sexual expression also removed barriers against drug use. Paris in the 1920s was a pressure cooker of talent and trauma, sophistication and self-destruction, where the boundary between artistic experimentation and personal dissolution often blurred beyond recognition. Part 2. The Birth of a Wonder Drug. To understand how heroin became a craze in 1920s Paris, we must first understand what heroin actually was, where it came from, and how it transitioned from pharmaceutical miracle to social menace. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of medical innovation, commercial ambition, and tragic miscalculation. The story begins not in Paris, but in the laboratories of Germany, in the offices of what would become one of the world's most powerful pharmaceutical companies. Opium had been used for thousands of years. Ancient Sumerian tablets from 3400 BCE refer to the opium poppy as the joy plant. Egyptian medical texts describe its use for calming crying children. Greek physicians prescribed it for pain relief. Throughout the Roman Empire, opium was a standard medicinal substance. It traveled along trade routes from the Mediterranean to China, from the Middle East to India, becoming embedded in medical practices across civilizations. But opium was unpredictable. The concentration of active ingredients varied wildly depending on growing conditions, harvesting methods, preparation techniques. Overdoses were common because dosing remained more art than science. Physicians needed something more reliable, more standardized, more powerful. In the early 1800s, a German pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Serturner managed to isolate the active ingredient in opium. He called it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This was a revolutionary development. For the first time, doctors could prescribe a standardized dose of a pain-killing substance. Morphine proved 10 times more powerful than crude opium. The invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s made morphine even more effective. Injected directly into the bloodstream, morphine provided almost instant pain relief. During the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, morphine became the painkiller of choice for treating wounded soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of men received morphine injections for battlefield injuries. And hundreds of thousands of men became addicted. By the 1870s, physicians began recognizing a disturbing pattern. Patients who had been treated with morphine for pain often found themselves unable to stop using the drug after their original ailment had healed. They experienced terrible withdrawal symptoms when they tried to quit: sweating, shaking, nausea, muscle pain, profound anxiety. The term morphinomany entered medical vocabulary, describing this new form of addiction. The medical establishment faced a crisis. Morphine was unquestionably effective for treating pain, but it was also clearly dangerous. Doctors searched desperately for an alternative, for a painkiller that offered morphine's benefits without its addictive properties. Enter the Bayer Company of Germany. In 1897, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann was working in Bayer's pharmaceutical research department. He was experimenting with a process called acetylation, which involved adding acetyl groups to various molecules to change their properties. In August of that year, just 11 days after synthesizing aspirin, Hoffmann successfully acetylated morphine. The result was diacetylmorphine, a substance that proved to be 1.5 to 2 times more potent than morphine itself. Bayer's research director, Heinrich Dreser, quickly recognized the commercial potential. He organized trials that seemed to show the new drug was highly effective against coughs and didn't produce morphine's addictive effects. Based on these initial, woefully inadequate studies, Bayer decided to market the new compound. They needed a name. Something that conveyed strength, effectiveness, power. Someone suggested heroisch, the German word for heroic, and so the drug was christened heroin. In 1898, Bayer launched one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaigns the world had yet seen. Heroin was promoted as a miracle cure for coughs, bronchitis, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various respiratory ailments. More remarkably, it was marketed as a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine, perfect for weaning morphine addicts off their dependency. The irony is almost unbearable in retrospect. Heroin was supposed to cure morphine addiction. Instead, it would create an addiction crisis that dwarfed anything morphine had produced. Bayer distributed free samples to physicians. The company published glowing clinical papers in medical journals. Advertisements appeared in newspapers across Europe and America, showing smiling children being given heroin for their coughs, happy families whose lives had been improved by this wonderful new medicine. Within a year of its introduction, Bayer was producing more than a ton of heroin annually, selling it in 23 countries. By 1900, heroin had become Bayer's most profitable product, outselling even aspirin. Doctors prescribed it freely. Pharmacies sold it over the counter. You could buy heroin lozenges, heroin pastilles, heroin salts, heroin in solution. It was administered to children for coughs, to women for menstrual pain, to the elderly for general aches and ailments. No one yet understood the catastrophe they were unleashing. The first hints of trouble appeared within just a few years. By 1903, medical journals were publishing reports of patients who had developed dependencies on heroin. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, which had initially praised heroin as non-addictive, was now publishing case studies of heroin addiction. Physicians noticed that many patients who came for heroin prescriptions didn't actually seem to be sick. They were seeking the drug itself. In 1913, Bayer quietly stopped producing heroin for medical use, but by then it was far too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Other pharmaceutical companies continued manufacturing the drug. Illicit producers had learned the relatively simple chemistry required to acetylate morphine. Heroin had escaped the controlled environment of medicine and was making its way into the broader world. And nowhere would it find more fertile ground than in the streets, salons, and opium dens of post-war Paris. Part 3. The Seeds of French Drug Culture. France had its own complicated relationship with narcotics long before heroin arrived on the scene. To understand the heroin craze of the 1920s, we must first examine the drug culture that had been developing in Paris for decades. The phenomenon began, as many such things did, in the consulting rooms of physicians. In the 1860s and 1870s, morphine became popular among French doctors as a treatment for pain. The hypodermic syringe was still a relatively new technology, and there was something almost magical about its ability to provide instant relief. A patient suffering from severe pain could receive a morphine injection and find comfort within minutes. For physicians who had watched helplessly as their patients suffered, this was revolutionary. But morphine uses quickly escaped medical control. By the 1880s, morphine had become fashionable in certain Parisian circles. Elite salons began featuring what were delicately called morphine evenings, where sophisticated men and women would gather to inject each other with the drug. This wasn't seen as vice, at least not initially. It was viewed as a form of refined pleasure, an experience for the educated and cultured, something that separated the bohemian elite from the unsophisticated masses. The French medical establishment watched this development with growing alarm. Physicians and psychiatrists began documenting what they called morphinomanie, the compulsive use of morphine. They noticed patterns. Patients who started using morphine for legitimate pain often continued long after the original ailment had healed. Users developed tolerance, requiring ever larger doses to achieve the same effect. When they tried to stop, they experienced terrible withdrawal symptoms. More disturbing, morphine use was spreading beyond the salons of the elite. By the late 1880s, morphine had appeared in the brasseries and cafes of Paris, available to a much broader segment of society. Prostitutes used it, artists used it. Working-class individuals discovered they could buy morphine from complicit pharmacists or shady doctors willing to write prescriptions for a price. The term toxicomany emerged in the early 1900s as an umbrella category for addiction to various substances: morphine, cocaine, opium, hashish, and eventually heroin. Although these drugs had different properties and effects, medical and popular discourse grouped them together, treating all forms of drug dependency as manifestations of the same underlying problem. This was connected to broader anxieties about national decline. France in the late 19th century was obsessed with the concept of degeneration. The nation's birth rate was falling. France had been humiliated in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. There were fears that the French race was weakening, becoming less vital, less capable of competing with other European powers. Drug addiction fit perfectly into this narrative of degeneration. Doctors and social commentators describe drug use as both a symptom and a cause of national decay. The drug addict was portrayed as weak-willed, selfish, incapable of fulfilling civic duties, unfit for reproduction. Drug addiction, it was said, would spread through society like a disease, corrupting the population, undermining France's strength and vitality. Leading physicians called for stricter regulation of narcotics. They wanted licensing requirements for doctors who prescribed these substances, limits on pharmacy sales, penalties for illegal distribution. But their calls largely fell on deaf ears. As long as drug addiction remained relatively rare, confined mostly to marginal populations, politicians saw no need for dramatic action. What finally spurred the French government to act was not concern about civilian drug use, but fear about the military. In 1907, a naval officer named Charles Benjamin Ulmo was arrested for attempting to sell military secrets to a foreign power. This alone would have been serious enough, but the case took a bizarre turn when it emerged that Ulmo was addicted to opium. He had been frequenting opium dens in the naval port of Toulon, spending large sums of money on the drug, desperately seeking funds to support his habit. The Ulmo case caused a sensation in France. Here was proof that drug addiction could compromise national security, that it could turn loyal officers into traitors. Ulmo's defense argued that opium had impaired his judgment, that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions because he was under the drug's influence. The court wasn't persuaded, but the damage to the military's reputation was done. In October 1908, the French government issued a decree imposing strict controls on opium commerce and consumption. This was France's first serious attempt to regulate narcotic drugs. It wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, opium dens had been proliferating in Paris, particularly in Montmartre. These establishments catered to a variety of clientele, from wealthy bohemians seeking exotic experiences to hardcore addicts desperate for their next dose. The dens were often hidden behind innocent-looking facades, accessed through back entrances, protected by lookouts who could warn of police raids. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with sweet, cloying smoke. Customers reclined on low couches or straw mats, passing around long bamboo pipes with ornate bowls. An attendant would prepare the opium, heating it over a small lamp until it bubbled, then carefully positioning the pipe so the smoker could inhale the vapors. The effect was described as deeply relaxing, almost dreamlike, transporting users to what the French called artificial paradises. The artistic community was particularly drawn to opium. The poet Charles Baudelaire had written extensively about his experiences with opium and hashish in his 1860 book Les Paradis Artificiels. He described how these drugs could magnify sensations, deepen perceptions, unlock creative insights that were otherwise inaccessible. Other writers and artists read Baudelaire's accounts and wanted to experience these altered states for themselves. In the early 1900s, Pablo Picasso was among the young artists experimenting with opium in Montmartre. He and his friends would gather in his studio at Le Bateau Lavoir, the ramshackle artist's residence on Rue Ravignan, and spend evenings smoking from Picasso's favourite bamboo pipe. They saw opium as a tool for artistic exploration, a way to access different modes of perception that could inform their revolutionary approaches to painting. But the risks were becoming increasingly apparent. In 1908, Picasso found his close friend Karl-Heinz Wiegels dead, hanging from the ceiling of his apartment. Wiegels had suffered a psychotic break following an overdose of hashish and opium, and had killed himself in the depths of drug-induced paranoia. The incident shook Picasso deeply. He vowed never to use opium again, though his abstinence wouldn't last forever. By the 1910s, Paris had developed a fully formed drug subculture. Opium dens operated throughout the city. Morphine and cocaine were available from corrupt doctors and pharmacists. Hashish could be purchased in certain cafes. Drug use remained primarily the province of artists, prostitutes, criminals, and the wealthy bohemian class. But it was spreading. Then came the war. Part 4. The war and its aftermath. The First World War changed everything about European society, including its relationship with drugs. During the war years from 1914 to 1918, drug use in France actually declined in some ways. Many of the young men who had been using drugs were now in the trenches, where access to narcotics was limited. The opium trade from French Indochina was disrupted by wartime shipping restrictions. Law enforcement resources that had been directed at drug trafficking were redirected to the war effort. But the war also planted seeds that would flower in the 1920s into a full-blown drug epidemic. Millions of soldiers were treated with morphine for battlefield injuries. The scale of the carnage was unprecedented. Artillery shells blew men's bodies apart. Machine gun fire created horrific wounds. Gas attacks burned lungs and skin. The medical response relied heavily on morphine to manage pain, often administered in quantities and frequencies that would have been unthinkable in civilian medicine. Some of these soldiers became addicted. They returned from the war carrying not just physical scars, but a dependency on the drug that had helped them endure their suffering. Back in civilian life, they sought out morphine or its more powerful cousin, heroin, to manage both their pain and their psychological trauma. The war also created a generation of traumatized individuals desperately seeking escape from their memories. Veterans who had witnessed the horrors of trench warfare often found themselves haunted by what they had seen. They woke screaming from nightmares of mud and blood and gas. They flinched at loud noises. They struggled to reintegrate into a society that couldn't possibly understand what they had endured. Some turned to alcohol. Others turned to drugs. The psychological impact extended beyond soldiers to civilians as well. Nearly every family in France had lost someone in the war. Grief was universal. The certainties of the pre-war world had been shattered. Traditional religion seemed inadequate to explain or justify such massive suffering. Social conventions that had once seemed immutable now appeared arbitrary and absurd. In this atmosphere of disillusionment and despair, drugs offered temporary escape. Opium could provide a few hours of peace, of freedom from anxiety and sorrow. Heroin delivered a rush of euphoria that could, however briefly, make one forget the unbearable weight of existence. The pharmaceutical landscape had also changed. During the war, several countries, including the United States, had begun restricting heroin use. The 1912 Hague International Opium Convention had called for controls on narcotic drugs. The 1914 Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the United States had begun regulating opiates and cocaine. By 1924, the United States would ban heroin entirely, both for medical and recreational use. But France was slower to implement restrictions. In the early 1920s, heroin was still legal in France for medical purposes, though increasingly regulated. More importantly, the infrastructure for illegal heroin production and distribution was beginning to develop. This is where Marseille enters our story. Marseille, France's great Mediterranean port, had long been a centre of smuggling and organised crime. The city's Corsican underworld controlled much of the illegal activity in southern France, running operations that included prostitution, gambling and contraband smuggling. In the 1920s and 1930s, these criminals would discover that heroin offered unprecedented profit potential. Two men in particular, Paul Carbone and François Spirito, would become the godfathers of what would later be known as the French Connection. Both were Corsican-born gangsters who had established themselves in Marseille's underworld. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, they began developing a system for importing raw opium from Turkey and Lebanon, processing it into heroin in clandestine laboratories near Marseille, and then smuggling the finished product to markets in America and elsewhere. The first illegal heroin laboratory in France was discovered in Bandol, near Marseille, in 1937. It was run by Carbone's organisation. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. By the 1930s, Marseille had become the heroin capital of Europe, with multiple labs converting morphine base into high-purity heroin for export. However, we're getting ahead of our story. In the immediate post-war period of the early 1920s, the organised heroin trade was still in its infancy. The heroin craze that gripped Paris during this time was fueled not primarily by international trafficking, but by domestically produced or legally imported pharmaceutical heroin, combined with morphine and opium that had been around for decades. Part 5. The Lost Generation. The influx of American expatriates to Paris in the 1920s created a unique subculture that would significantly shape the city's drug scene. They called themselves the Lost Generation, though the term's origins remain somewhat disputed. Gertrude Stein claimed she first heard it from a French garage owner who used Génération Perdue to describe the young mechanics who had failed to properly repair her car. She turned the phrase on Ernest Hemingway, declaring, "You are all a lost generation." Hemingway used it as one of the epigraphs for his 1926 novel, The Sun Also Rises, cementing its association with the American expatriates in Paris. Lost, they certainly were. These were men and women who had come of age during or immediately after the war, who had witnessed the collapse of the old world order, who felt alienated from the materialism and conformity of 1920s America. They came to Paris seeking freedom, inspiration, community, and a meaning. What they found was a city that allowed them to live in ways that would have been impossible back home. Prohibition had gone into effect in the United States in 1920, making alcohol illegal. But in Paris, wine flowed freely and cheaply. Absinthe, banned in many countries, could still be found in certain establishments. The cafes stayed open late and no one cared how much you drank or what you did. Sexual mores were looser in Paris. Homosexuality, heavily stigmatized and illegal in much of America, was more openly tolerated in certain Parisian circles. Affairs were common. Open relationships abounded. The city offered a liberation from the puritanical restrictions that many Americans found suffocating. This freedom extended to drugs as well. The American expatriates arrived in a Paris that already had an established drug culture. Opium dens still operated in Montmartre. Morphine and cocaine were available to those who knew where to look. And heroin, marketed as a wonder drug just years before, could still be obtained through various legal and semi-legal channels. Many of the lost generation writers and artists experimented with these substances. Opium was particularly fashionable, viewed as exotic and artistic. Jean Cocteau, the French writer and artist who moved in the same circles as the American expatriates, became seriously addicted to opium in the 1920s. He had first been prescribed laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium, as a teenager to treat depression. That early exposure led to a lifelong struggle with addiction. Cocteau's opium use was well known among his friends and colleagues. He would sometimes smoke opium at the studio of the surrealist painter André Masson on Rue Blomet. These gatherings, which often included other luminaries like Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Max Ernst, and Man Ray, featured passionate discussions about art and society, accompanied by abundant opium smoking and drinking of Mandarin Curaçao. The Surrealist movement, which emerged in the early 1920s, had a complex relationship with drugs. André Breton, the father of French Surrealism, was actually opposed to drug use. He believed Surrealism should emerge from the subconscious mind through techniques like automatic writing and dream interpretation, not through chemical manipulation. But many of his fellow Surrealists disagreed. Antonin Artaud, the writer and theatre director who was part of the Surrealist circle, was an outspoken advocate for drug use. He had been addicted to various substances since adolescence, including opium, morphine, laudanum, and cocaine. In 1925, when anti-drug crusaders in France were advocating for the criminalization of cocaine, Artaud published an impassioned defense in the Surrealist journal La Révolution Surréaliste. Inasmuch as we shall never be able to identify and eliminate the causes of despair in humanity, Artaud wrote, we have no right to prevent a person from using whatever means they choose to escape that despair. It was a philosophy that resonated with many in the lost generation. These were people who had inherited a world of despair, who had watched civilization tear itself apart in the trenches, who could no longer believe in the old certainties. If drugs offered temporary escape, if they provided brief moments of peace or euphoria, why shouldn't one indulge? Pablo Picasso continued his involvement with opium during the 1920s, despite his earlier vow to quit. His girlfriend, Fernande Olivier, wrote about finding him and his friends sprawled on straw mats in his studio, passing around his favorite bamboo opium pipe, while ghostly shadows from a small oil lamp danced across his canvases. The American writer Juna Barnes, who arrived in Paris in the 1920s, descended into alcoholism and depression during this period. Her experimental works like Lady's Almanac and Nightwood reflected the bohemian, drug-saturated atmosphere of expatriate Paris. Her partner Thelma Wood's alcoholism and probable drug use contributed to the breakdown of their relationship, sending Barnes even deeper into her own substance abuse. F. Scott Fitzgerald, freshly successful from The Great Gatsby, spent much of his time in Paris attending parties and nightclubs, particularly in Montmartre. His prodigious alcohol consumption was legendary, but there were also rumours of cocaine use, though these remain unconfirmed. Fitzgerald's own descent into alcoholism and depression mirrored the trajectory of many lost generation figures who came to Paris seeking artistic freedom but found instead a path towards self-destruction. Ernest Hemingway presents an interesting case. His public persona was of the hard-drinking, hard-living adventurer, but he was actually quite disapproving of drug use. In his memoir, A Movable Feast, he describes the Paris drug scene with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. He maintained friendships with drug users like Jean Cocteau, but kept his distance from their more extreme indulgences. Still, Hemingway's Paris was inextricably linked with the culture of intoxication, even if his drug of choice was alcohol rather than heroin or opium. The cafes where he wrote, the bars where he drank, the artistic circles in which he moved were all touched by the drug culture that permeated post-war Paris. Part 6. The Geography of Vice. To understand the heroin craze of 1920s Paris, one must understand the physical spaces where drug use occurred. The geography of vice in Paris was specific, concentrated in certain neighbourhoods that became synonymous with decadence and danger. Montmartre, the hilly neighbourhood in the north of Paris, had been the centre of Parisian nightlife since the late 19th century. The area had officially been incorporated into Paris only in 1860, and it retained some of its village-like character even as it became increasingly urbanised. Artists were drawn to Montmartre because rents were cheap and the atmosphere was bohemian. Cabarets and music halls proliferated along the Boulevard de Clichy and the Boulevard Rochechouart. The Moulin Rouge, perhaps the most famous cabaret in the world, had opened in 1889. It featured the scandalous can-can dance, with performers kicking their legs high and flashing their underwear to delighted audiences. But the Moulin Rouge was just one of dozens of establishments in the area. There was Le Chat Noir, the first modern cabaret, which had closed in 1897, but whose influence persisted. There was the Cabaret de l'Enfer, the Cabaret of Hell, with its demonic entrance designed to look like the gaping mouth of Leviathan, where waiters dressed as devils served drinks to tourists seeking thrills. These legitimate entertainment venues existed alongside more sordid establishments. Montmartre was also home to numerous brothels, illegal gambling dens, and opium parlours. The authorities generally tolerated this concentration of vice as long as it remained confined to certain areas and didn't spill over into respectable neighbourhoods. By the 1920s, Montmartre had developed a serious drug problem. Cocaine and morphine were the most commonly sold drugs in the area, with organised crime syndicates monopolising distribution in many of the dance halls. Drug dealers operated openly in some venues, selling their wares to dancers, musicians, sex workers and customers alike. Opium dens proliferated during this period. These were often hidden in back rooms or basement spaces, accessible only to those who knew where to look or who were introduced by existing customers. The dens in Montmartre catered to different clienteles. Some were relatively upscale, decorated with oriental rugs and cushions, attracting wealthy bohemians and curious tourists. Others were squalid, dangerous places where desperate addicts gathered to smoke whatever opium they could afford. The authorities were aware of these establishments but struggled to shut them down. Raids would close one den, only for another to open elsewhere. The owners often had connections to organised crime groups that could offer protection through bribery or intimidation. And there was a certain amount of official tolerance based on the idea that it was better to have drug use concentrated in known locations rather than spread throughout the city. Pigalle, the district adjacent to Montmartre, developed a similar reputation. The area around Place Pigalle became known for its nightclubs, strip clubs and sex shops. Drug dealers worked the streets, approaching potential customers with whispered offers. Women stood in doorways selling both sex and drugs to whoever could pay. The Latin Quarter, on the left bank of the Seine, had a different character but was equally touched by drug culture. This was the traditional bohemian neighbourhood, home to students from the nearby Sorbonne, to struggling writers living in cheap hotels, to artists working in cramped garret studios. The cafes of the Latin Quarter, particularly Café de Flore and Les Deux Magots in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, became gathering places for the intellectual and artistic elite. Gertrude Stein held her famous salons at her apartment on Rue de Fleurus in the 6th arrondissement. These weren't drug parties, at least not primarily, but they brought together people who moved in circles where drug use was common. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Picasso, Matisse, Ezra Pound, Sherwood Anderson, all would attend Stein's gatherings. Many of these individuals had experimented with or were actively using drugs. The bookstore Shakespeare and Company, run by Sylvia Beach on Rue de l'Odéon, served as a lending library and a meeting place for the lost generation. Beach herself didn't use drugs and ran a respectable establishment, but many of her customers were deeply involved in the drug scene. James Joyce, though not a heavy drug user himself, was aware of and documented the drug culture in his experimental works. Montmartre, another left-bank neighbourhood, became a major centre of expatriate life in the 1920s. The Dingo Bar, where Hemingway and Fitzgerald first met, was located here. The area was filled with cheap hotels, affordable restaurants, and cafes that stayed open late. Drug use was common in the bars and cafes of Montparnasse, though perhaps somewhat less visible than in Montmartre. What's striking about the geography of drug use in 1920s Paris is how public and semi-public it was. Unlike later periods when drug use would be driven completely underground, in the 1920s drugs were used in cafes and cabarets, in artist studios, in hotel rooms that friends freely entered. There was relatively little shame attached to drug use in certain circles. It was seen as part of the artistic lifestyle, as a legitimate form of experimentation. This openness had consequences. It normalized drug use, making it seem less dangerous than it actually was. Young people arriving in Paris, seeking to join the artistic community, saw established writers and artists using drugs and assumed this was simply part of the Parisian experience. The visible drug culture attracted curious tourists who wanted to taste the forbidden, and it created an infrastructure, a network of dealers and users and enablers that would persist and expand throughout the decade. Part 7. The Mechanics of the Trade. How did heroin actually reach the streets, cafes, and opium dens of Paris? Who were the dealers, the middlemen, the suppliers? What were the economics of the heroin trade in the 1920s? The heroin that circulated in Paris during the 1920s came from several sources. Some was pharmaceutical heroin, legally manufactured by companies like Bayer, and then diverted into illegal channels through theft, corrupt pharmacists, or complicit doctors writing unnecessary prescriptions. Some was manufactured in clandestine laboratories, particularly as the decade wore on and legal supplies became more restricted, and some was imported from other countries where heroin production was still legal or poorly regulated. The early 1920s was something of a transition period in international drug control. The 1912 Hague International Opium Convention had called for countries to regulate narcotics, but implementation was inconsistent. Some countries moved quickly to restrict heroin, while others lagged behind. This created opportunities for smugglers who could source heroin from permissive jurisdictions and sell it in more restrictive markets. Pharmacies remained a significant source of heroin and morphine in early 1920s France. Although regulations existed, enforcement was lax. A corrupt pharmacist could make significant money by selling drugs without proper prescriptions, or by selling far more than prescriptions called for. Some pharmacies became known among users as places where one could obtain drugs with minimal questions asked. Doctors too could be sources, either through legitimate prescriptions written for patients who didn't actually need the drugs, or through outright sales of heroin and morphine to addicts willing to pay. The medical profession in France in the 1920s was not highly regulated by modern standards. It was relatively easy for an unethical physician to profit from drug sales without facing significant consequences. But increasingly, organized crime was taking control of the drug trade. The Corsican gangs that controlled much of the criminal activity in Marseille and parts of Paris recognized the profit potential in heroin. Unlike prostitution or gambling, which required physical establishments and significant overhead, drug dealing could be conducted relatively discreetly with high profit margins. Paul Carbone and François Spirito, the Marseille gangsters who would later become infamous as architects of the French Connection, began their criminal careers in the 1920s. Initially, they focused on prostitution and gambling. Carbone had started as a pimp, controlling brothels in the Panier and Belsance neighbourhoods of Marseille. Spirito had come from Lyon with connections to prostitution networks. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, they began expanding into opium and heroin. They established smuggling routes from Turkey and Lebanon, where opium was still legally grown, shipping morphine base to Marseille where it could be converted to heroin. The first laboratory directly controlled by Carbone was discovered in 1937, but they had been involved in the trade for years before that. The Marseille connection to Paris was direct. Organised crime groups that controlled drug distribution in the capital often had ties to the Marseille gangs. Drugs would be shipped from Marseille to Paris by train or automobile, hidden in legitimate cargo or smuggled in specially designed compartments. Once in Paris, the drugs would be distributed to dealers who worked specific neighbourhoods or establishments. The economics were compelling. Raw opium could be purchased relatively cheaply in Turkey or Lebanon. The conversion to morphine base and then to heroin didn't require sophisticated equipment or rare chemicals. The resulting heroin could then be sold at enormous markup in Paris or exported to America, where prices were even higher. Dealers in Paris operated at various levels. Some were sophisticated operators connected to organised crime groups, moving large quantities and serving wealthy clientele. Others were small-time hustlers working dance halls and cafes, selling individual doses to whoever would buy. Still others were users who dealt on the side to support their own habits. The customer base was diverse. Wealthy bohemians could afford to buy high-quality heroin from reliable sources. Working-class users made do with cheaper, often adulterated product. Artists and writers sometimes had special relationships with dealers who extended credit or traded drugs for artwork or manuscripts. Prices fluctuated based on supply, quality, and the relationship between dealer and customer. A dose of heroin might cost anywhere from a few francs to quite a substantial sum for pharmaceutical-grade product. For many users, supporting a heroin habit required either significant wealth or engagement in crime, prostitution, or other income-generating activities. The heroin itself varied wildly in purity and quality. Pharmaceutical heroin that had been diverted from medical stocks was relatively pure and predictable in dosage. Heroin from clandestine labs could be anything from high-quality product to dangerous adulterated mixtures. Dealers often cut heroin with other white powders to increase their profits, creating unpredictable and potentially deadly products. Methods of use also varied. Some users preferred to inject heroin, which provided the most intense and immediate effect, but also carried risks of infection, vein damage, and accidental overdose. Others sniffed heroin powder through the nose, a method that was slow-acting but didn't require needles. Still others smoked heroin, particularly those who had started with opium and transitioned to its more potent derivative. The paraphernalia of drug use became familiar in certain circles. Syringes and needles were openly sold in some pharmacies. Opium pipes, some of them quite beautiful and ornate, were collector's items. Small metal spoons for measuring powder, tourniquets for finding veins, matches for heating heroin before injection, all these items became part of the material culture of addiction. Part 8. The Social Epidemiology of Heroin Use. Who used heroin in 1920s? Paris. The answer is both simple and complex. Nearly everyone and no one, depending on how you looked at it. In absolute numbers, heroin users remained a small minority of Paris's population. Most Parisians never touched the drug. They worked their jobs, raised their families, attended church, participated in civic life, and viewed drug users with a mixture of pity, contempt, and fear. The drug scene was concentrated in specific neighborhoods and social circles, leaving most of the city untouched. But within those circles where heroin use was common, it could seem universal. An artist living in Montmartre in the mid-1920s might know dozens of heroin users. A prostitute working in Pigalle would encounter the drug daily. A writer frequenting the expatriate cafes would be surrounded by people who had at least experimented with heroin or other narcotics. The demographics of heroin use tell an interesting story. In the early period, before the war, morphine and opium use had been concentrated among wealthy bohemians and the demi-monde, the shadowy world of artists, prostitutes, and social outsiders. These were people with money and leisure time who could afford expensive drugs and the lifestyle that went with them. Post-war heroin use spread more broadly. Veterans who had become addicted to morphine during the war sought out heroin as a substitute. Working-class individuals discovered they could buy heroin more cheaply than alcohol in some establishments. Sex workers used heroin to cope with the demands and degradations of their profession. Musicians in jazz clubs found that heroin helped them perform for long hours despite fatigue. Women made up a significant portion of heroin users. In France, as in other countries, there was a pattern of female addiction linked to both medical prescriptions and social marginalization. Women were more likely than men to be prescribed morphine or heroin for various complaints, real or imagined. The medical establishment of the time viewed women as more prone to hysteria and nervous conditions, and readily prescribed powerful drugs to treat these supposed ailments. Some women became addicted through these medical channels and then transitioned to illicit sources when their prescriptions ran out, or doctors became unwilling to continue providing drugs. Other women were introduced to heroin by male partners, boyfriends or husbands who were themselves users. Still others turned to drugs as a coping mechanism for difficult life circumstances, whether poverty, abusive relationships, or the trauma of war and its aftermath. The artistic community's involvement with heroin was well known and contributed to a kind of glamorization of drug use. When famous writers, painters, and musicians used heroin, it created a model that others, particularly young people aspiring to artistic careers, might emulate. There was a romantic notion that drugs enhanced creativity, that they provided access to realms of experience and perception that were closed to the sober mind. This belief wasn't entirely without foundation. Many artists did report that drugs altered their consciousness in ways that informed their work. But the long-term costs, the addiction, the health problems, the personal destruction were often not apparent until it was too late. The medical profession itself was not immune. Some doctors and nurses became addicted to the drugs they prescribed and administered. They had easy access, they understood the effects, and they sometimes convinced themselves that their medical knowledge would protect them from addiction. It rarely did. Class played a significant role in how heroin addiction was experienced and perceived. Wealthy users could afford high-quality heroin, could access medical treatment if needed, could maintain an outward appearance of respectability even while addicted. Poor users bought cheap, adulterated product, suffered more health consequences, and were more likely to be arrested and imprisoned. The French medical and psychiatric establishment studied heroin addiction extensively during the 1920s. They produced numerous papers and books documenting the phenomenon, analyzing its causes, proposing treatments. Much of this work was influenced by the degeneration theories that had dominated French medicine since the late 19th century. Doctors described heroin addiction as both a symptom and a cause of individual and social decay. The heroin addict was portrayed as weak-willed, selfish, unable to fulfill social responsibilities. Addiction was seen as spreading through populations like a contagious disease, threatening the health of the nation. There was genuine concern, particularly among public health officials, that heroin use would spread from marginal populations to the mainstream. If working-class men became addicted, who would labor in the factories? If women of childbearing age became addicted, how would France address its already low birth rate? If children gained access to heroin, what would become of the next generation? These fears were not entirely unfounded, but they were often exaggerated and sensationalized. Newspapers published lurid accounts of heroin dens and drug-crazed criminals. Politicians gave speeches warning of the drug menace. Social reformers called for action to save France from this growing scourge. Part 9. The Price of Paradise. The human cost of the heroin craze cannot be measured solely in statistics or police reports. It played out in individual lives destroyed, families torn apart, potential unrealized, talent wasted. Consider the case of a fictional but representative figure, whom we'll call Marie. She was a dance hall performer in Montmartre, working 6 nights a week in one of the establishments on Boulevard de Clichy. Marie had come to Paris from a small village in Normandy, seeking opportunity and excitement in the capital. She was talented, beautiful, ambitious, but the dance hall work was exhausting. Long hours on her feet, constant pressure to smile and flirt with customers, pressure from management to drink with patrons and encourage them to spend money. Some of the other dancers used cocaine to maintain their energy. A dealer who frequented the hall offered Marie a taste, free of charge. She tried it and felt wonderful, alert and confident, and capable of dancing all night. Soon she was buying cocaine regularly, but cocaine was expensive, and Marie's wages barely covered her rent and food. The dealer suggested she try heroin instead. "Cheaper," he said, and it would help her relax after work. She tried it and discovered a kind of peace she had never known, a warm blanket of contentment that made all her worries disappear. Within months, Marie was addicted. She needed heroin just to feel normal. When she couldn't afford to buy it, withdrawal symptoms made her desperately ill. She began trading sexual favors for drugs. Eventually, she left the dance hall altogether and became a full-time prostitute, working the streets of Pigalle, using her earnings to buy heroin and barely surviving. By age 25, Marie was dead, an overdose of impure heroin sold by a dealer who had cut the product with a toxic substance. Her body was found in a cheap hotel room. She was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. Her family in Normandy never learned what had happened to their daughter, who had gone to Paris to become a dancer. Marie's story was repeated in countless variations across Paris in the 1920s. Young people came to the city seeking art, adventure, freedom. They discovered drugs. Some managed to use recreationally without becoming addicted. Many did not. The physical effects of heroin addiction were well documented by physicians of the era. Chronic users developed a characteristic appearance: pale skin, dilated pupils, extreme thinness due to suppressed appetite, marks on their arms from repeated injections. They suffered from constipation, a common side effect of opiates. Their immune systems were compromised, making them vulnerable to tuberculosis and other infectious diseases that were still common in 1920s Paris. Withdrawal from heroin was described as excruciatingly painful. Users who tried to quit experienced severe muscle pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, shaking, anxiety, and profound depression. The symptoms could last for days or even weeks. Many users found it easier to continue using than to endure withdrawal. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Heroin addiction reorganized the entire structure of a person's life around obtaining and using the drug. Relationships deteriorated, employment became impossible, personal hygiene declined. Long-term users often developed depression and other mental health problems. Overdose was an ever-present danger. Because the purity and composition of street heroin were unpredictable, users never quite knew what they were getting. A dose that would normally provide the desired effect might, if the heroin was purer than expected, prove fatal. Dealers who cut their product inconsistently created Russian roulette conditions for their customers. The combination of heroin with other substances multiplied the dangers. Users who mixed heroin with alcohol, cocaine, or other drugs faced increased risk of respiratory depression and cardiac arrest. Many deaths attributed to heroin actually resulted from polysubstance use. Crime was another consequence. Supporting a heroin habit was expensive, particularly as tolerance developed and users required larger and more frequent doses. Many addicts turned to theft, burglary, robbery, or prostitution to fund their drug use. This created a vicious cycle. Drug use led to crime, which led to arrest and imprisonment, which only made it harder to escape addiction. Women faced particular dangers. Female heroin addicts were extremely vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Many became involved in prostitution either to earn money for drugs or because pimps and dealers kept them addicted as a form of control. Pregnancy while addicted to heroin created risks for both mother and child. Babies born to addicted mothers were themselves born dependent and had to be gradually weaned off the drug. The artistic community's romance with drugs came with a terrible price. For every Picasso who experimented with opium and moved on, there were dozens of less famous artists whose careers and lives were destroyed by addiction. Promising painters who never completed major works, writers who stopped writing, musicians who could no longer perform. Jean Cocteau, the French writer and artist who became one of the most famous heroin addicts of the era, struggled with addiction for much of his life. He made multiple attempts to quit, checking himself into clinics and sanitariums, but always relapsed. His addiction damaged his health, disrupted his work, and caused pain to everyone who cared about him. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he produced works that dealt explicitly with his drug experiences, including the film Opium and various written accounts of addiction. Cocteau was fortunate in many ways. He had wealth, connections, access to medical care. Many addicts had none of these advantages. They suffered in obscurity, died in squalor, were forgotten by history. The families of addicts endured their own torment. Parents watched helplessly as their children destroyed themselves. Spouses struggled to support households while their partners spent all money on drugs. Children grew up in homes where addiction created chaos and neglect. Part 10. Voices of Warning. Not everyone in 1920s Paris celebrated or even tolerated the drug culture. Alongside the artists and bohemians who experimented with heroin, there were doctors, social reformers, politicians, and ordinary citizens who recognized the danger and called for action. The French medical establishment had been warning about drug addiction since the late 19th century. By the 1920s, these warnings had become more urgent and more specific. Medical journals published studies documenting the extent of heroin addiction, its physical and psychological effects, the difficulty of treatment. Doctors working in hospitals and clinics saw firsthand the consequences of heroin use. They treated patients suffering from abscesses at injection sites, from infections, from overdoses. They attempted to help addicts withdraw from the drug, often with limited success. They watched young people deteriorate rapidly under the influence of heroin. Many physicians called for stricter regulations on heroin distribution. They argued that the drug should be banned entirely, or at minimum that access should be severely restricted. They pushed for mandatory reporting of heroin prescriptions, for licensing requirements for doctors who prescribed opiates, for inspections of pharmacies to ensure compliance with existing regulations. But the medical profession itself was divided. Some doctors still believed that heroin and morphine had legitimate medical uses and should remain available for appropriate cases. They worried that overly strict regulations would prevent physicians from adequately treating pain. They argued for a balanced approach that would allow medical use while preventing diversion to illicit markets. Social reformers approached the drug problem from a different angle. Many were motivated by concerns about moral decay and national degeneration. They saw heroin use as a symptom of broader social problems, the breakdown of traditional family structures, the loosening of sexual mores, the influence of foreign, particularly American, cultural values. These reformers often took a moralistic stance, portraying drug users as weak and self-indulgent, in need of moral rehabilitation as much as medical treatment. Some advocated for harsh penalties for drug use and distribution, believing that fear of punishment would deter potential users. Religious organizations played a role in anti-drug advocacy. Catholic and Protestant groups saw drug use as sinful, a rejection of God's will, and a squandering of the gift of life. They established programs aimed at helping addicts recover, often combining spiritual guidance with practical support. The political response to the heroin craze was shaped by both domestic concerns and international pressures. France was a signatory to the 1912 Hague International Opium Convention, which called for countries to regulate narcotics. Throughout the 1920s, there were ongoing international discussions about drug control, with France participating in League of Nations conferences on the topic. In 1916, France had passed legislation strengthening controls on certain drugs. This was followed by additional regulations in the early 1920s. But enforcement remained inconsistent. The French government had many other priorities in the post-war period: economic reconstruction, political stability, managing international relations. Drug control, while acknowledged as important, was not always at the top of the agenda. There was also resistance to strict drug control from various quarters. The pharmaceutical industry had economic interests in continued legal production of morphine and heroin. Doctors valued their autonomy and resisted government oversight of their prescribing practices, and there was a libertarian strain in French political culture that viewed drug use as a personal choice that the state had limited right to regulate. Public opinion was mixed. Many ordinary Parisians were concerned about drugs, particularly about the visible drug culture in neighborhoods like Montmartre. They worried about the example being set for young people, about crime associated with drug use, about the deterioration of their city's character. But there was also a certain amount of tolerance, even fascination. The drug scene was part of what made Paris exciting, exotic, different from more conventional cities. Tourists came partly to see this transgressive culture. Some Parisians took a kind of pride in their city's bohemian reputation, even while disapproving of its excesses. The press played an important role in shaping public discourse about drugs. Newspapers published sensationalized accounts of drug dens and criminal activity. They printed interviews with doctors warning of the drug menace. They ran stories about specific cases: the artist who overdosed, the society woman revealed to be an addict, the prostitute who turned to crime to feed her habit. These stories both reflected and amplified public concern about drugs. They created pressure on politicians to take action, while also perhaps inadvertently romanticizing drug use and making it seem more widespread and glamorous than it actually was. Some voices called for a public health approach rather than a purely punitive one. These progressive thinkers argued that addiction was a medical condition that required treatment, not a moral failing that deserved punishment. They advocated for clinics where addicts could receive medical care, for programs to help users gradually reduce their drug consumption, for social services to address the underlying causes of addiction like poverty and trauma. But these voices were often drowned out by more conservative calls for law and order, for stricter penalties, for moral reformation. The predominant response to the heroin craze remained punitive rather than therapeutic. Part 11. The legal response. As the 1920s progressed and the heroin craze continued to spread, the French government gradually strengthened its legal framework for drug control. The 1920 law on dangerous drugs was an important step. This legislation placed opium, morphine, heroin, and cocaine under stricter controls. It required doctors to maintain records of all prescriptions for these substances. It mandated that pharmacies keep detailed logs of drug sales. It increased penalties for illegal production and distribution. But the law had significant weaknesses. Enforcement was left largely to local authorities, and dedication to drug control varied widely across different jurisdictions. Paris police might conduct regular raids on suspected drug dens, while authorities in other cities might take a more lax approach. The law also relied heavily on the medical profession to self-police, trusting doctors and pharmacists to follow the rules. Many did, but some did not. Throughout the 1920s, additional regulations were added. In 1922, France passed legislation implementing provisions of international drug control treaties. In 1924, responding to pressure from the United States and other countries, France agreed to stricter controls on heroin specifically. The enforcement infrastructure also developed during this period. Specialized police units were created to investigate drug trafficking. These officers worked to identify major dealers and distributors, to track smuggling routes, to shut down clandestine laboratories. They worked with customs officials to intercept drugs at borders and ports. But the police faced significant challenges. Drug dealers were often connected to powerful organized crime groups that could threaten or bribe officers. The sheer volume of drugs moving through Paris made it impossible to intercept more than a fraction, and the penalties for drug offences, while increased, were often still light enough that dealers considered them an acceptable cost of doing business. Courts struggled with how to handle drug cases. Should users be treated as criminals or as victims of addiction requiring treatment? Should dealers receive harsh sentences to deter others, or were they themselves often addicts dealing to support their own habits? Should wealthy addicts receive different treatment than poor ones? In practice, the justice system tended to be hardest on street-level dealers and users, particularly those from marginal populations like prostitutes and immigrants. Wealthy addicts often avoided prosecution entirely, receiving private medical treatment instead. Organized crime figures who controlled large-scale distribution frequently escaped conviction due to their political connections and sophisticated operations that insulated them from direct involvement in drug transactions. The international dimension of drug control became increasingly important as the decade progressed. The League of Nations held conferences in 1925 and 1931 specifically focused on drug issues. France participated in these discussions, agreeing in principle to stricter controls while often moving slowly to implement them domestically. The United States exerted significant pressure on France regarding drug control. American officials were concerned about heroin smuggled from France to the United States, particularly as domestic American production of heroin had been banned. American narcotics agents sometimes worked with French police on investigations, though this cooperation was not always smooth. By the late 1920s, the legal landscape had shifted considerably. Heroin was much more tightly controlled than it had been at the decade's beginning. Legitimate medical use of heroin was severely restricted. Penalties for illegal production and distribution were increased. The infrastructure for enforcement was stronger. But the heroin craze had not been stopped. It had simply been driven further underground. Illegal laboratories in Marseille and elsewhere continued to produce heroin for both domestic consumption and export. Organized crime groups adapted to the new legal environment, becoming more sophisticated in their smuggling and distribution methods. Users who could no longer obtain heroin from pharmacies or complicit doctors turned to street dealers, often getting inferior product at higher prices. Part 12. The turn of the decade. As the 1920s drew to a close, the heroin craze in Paris was beginning to wane, though drug use would remain a persistent problem. Several factors contributed to this decline. The legal restrictions implemented throughout the decade had made it genuinely more difficult to obtain heroin. Pharmaceutical heroin that had been diverted from medical stocks became much rarer as controls tightened. While clandestine production increased, it couldn't fully replace the supply of pharmaceutical-grade heroin that had previously been available. The economic crisis that began with the 1929 stock market crash and deepened in the early 1930s affected drug markets. Many users, particularly the wealthy bohemians who had fueled demand in the early part of the decade, found themselves with less disposable income. Tourism to Paris decreased, reducing the number of curious visitors seeking to experience the city's transgressive culture. The expatriate community that had been so central to 1920s Paris began to disperse. Some lost-generation figures returned to the United States, either by choice or forced by financial necessity. Others moved to different parts of Europe. The community that had gathered around Gertrude Stein's salon and Shakespeare and Company scattered. The concentration of American writers and artists that had made Paris the center of Anglo-American literary culture in the early 1920s had largely dissipated by the decade's end. Public attitudes were also shifting. The glamour associated with drug use in certain circles began to fade as the consequences became more apparent. Too many people had watched friends or loved ones destroyed by addiction. Too many promising artists had died or seen their careers ruined. The romantic notion of the drug-using artist suffering beautifully for their art was giving way to a more realistic understanding of addiction's grim reality. The medical profession's approach to addiction was evolving. While doctors still disagreed about treatment methods, there was growing recognition that addiction was a chronic condition requiring long-term management, not a moral failing that could be cured through willpower or punishment. Clinics specifically dedicated to treating addiction were established, offering both medical and psychological support to users trying to quit. The organized crime groups that had profited from the heroin trade were adapting to changing conditions. As the Paris market became more difficult due to enforcement efforts and declining demand, Marseille gangs increasingly focused on export, particularly to the United States. This would set the stage for the French connection that would dominate international heroin trafficking from the 1930s through the early 1970s. But, though the peak of the craze had passed, heroin uses in Paris never completely disappeared. It would ebb and flow over the following decades, influenced by wars, economic conditions, law enforcement efforts, and cultural trends. The infrastructure that had developed in the 1920s, the smuggling routes, the distribution networks, the knowledge of how to manufacture and market illicit drugs, all of this persisted. Part 13. Lasting Impacts. The heroin craze of 1920s. Paris left marks that would last far beyond the decade itself. On the most immediate level, thousands of individuals had become addicted to heroin during this period. Many would struggle with addiction for the rest of their lives. Some would die from overdoses or complications of drug use. Others would eventually quit, but would carry physical and psychological scars from their years of addiction. Families had been torn apart. Children had grown up in households disrupted by a parent's addiction. Marriages had dissolved. Promising careers had been derailed. The human cost, while difficult to quantify precisely, was enormous. The cultural impact was similarly significant. The association between Paris and drugs, between artistic bohemia and drug use, would persist in the popular imagination. Future generations of artists and writers, seeking to emulate the lost generation, might experiment with drugs partly because they believed this was what artists did. The work produced by artists during this period reflected their drug use in complex ways. Jean Cocteau's films and writings about opium provided unflinching accounts of addiction. Ernest Hemingway's fiction, while not explicitly about drugs, captured the lost generation's sense of disillusionment and search for meaning through sensory experience. Juna Barnes's experimental novels portrayed the psychological fragmentation that characterized the era. Whether drugs enhanced or hindered artistic production is impossible to say definitively. Certainly some artists produced important work while actively using drugs, but we can never know what they might have created had they remained sober. And for every successful artist who used drugs and survived, there were many more whose potential was never realized because addiction destroyed them before they could fully develop their talents. The policy responses to the heroin craze of the 1920s established patterns that would persist for decades. The tension between treating addiction as a medical problem versus treating it as a criminal matter, the debate between harm reduction and abstinence-only approaches, the challenge of balancing individual liberty against public health concerns, all of these issues that emerged in the 1920s, Paris remain unresolved today. The international drug control regime that developed in the 1920s and 1930s, with France as a major participant, created a framework that still shapes global drug policy. The League of Nations conventions were succeeded by United Nations treaties, but the basic approach of prohibiting certain substances while allowing medical use under strict controls originated in this period. France's experience with heroin also influenced how other countries approached drug policy. American officials studying the Paris drug scene used it as a cautionary tale when arguing for stricter controls domestically. British authorities looked to French regulations when developing their own drug laws. The French experience became a case study in what could happen when drug use was permitted to flourish relatively unchecked. The development of the French Connection, which had its origins in the 1920s and 1930s when Corsican gangs began organizing heroin production and smuggling, would shape the international heroin trade for decades. The route from Turkish opium fields to Marseille laboratories to American streets would be the dominant pathway for heroin until it was finally disrupted in the early 1970s. The medical understanding of addiction that developed during this period, recognizing it as a chronic condition rather than simply a moral failing, was an important advance, even though it took many more decades for this understanding to be widely accepted and translated into more humane treatment approaches. The 1920s also saw the beginning of the modern pharmaceutical industry's complicated relationship with addictive drugs. The Bayer Company's experience with heroin, promoting it as non-addictive only to watch it become one of the most problematic substances in history, foreshadowed later pharmaceutical industry controversies over OxyContin and other prescription opioids. Conclusion: lessons from a lost decade. As we reach the end of this long journey through the heroin craze of 1920s Paris, certain themes emerge that resonate across the decades to our present moment. The first lesson is about the danger of incomplete knowledge. When Bayer introduced heroin in 1898, they genuinely believed they had created a non-addictive alternative to morphine. The initial studies seem to support this conclusion. It took years of real-world use before the truth became apparent. This pattern has repeated throughout pharmaceutical history. A drug is introduced with great promise, only for hidden dangers to emerge after widespread use. The second lesson concerns the relationship between trauma and addiction. The First World War created a generation of traumatized individuals desperate for relief from psychological pain. Heroin offered temporary escape, but at a terrible cost. This connection between trauma and substance use remains relevant today as we grapple with the psychological aftermath of our own wars, disasters, and social upheavals. The third lesson involves the intersection of creativity and self-destruction. The lost generation's romanticization of drug use, as somehow connected to artistic vision, has proven persistent and destructive. While altered consciousness can provide novel perspectives, the price paid in addiction, deteriorating health, and wasted potential is rarely worth it. Brilliance and addiction may coexist, but they do not have a causal relationship. The fourth lesson relates to the challenge of drug control policy. France in the 1920s tried various approaches: moral prohibition, medical regulation, law enforcement crackdowns. None proved entirely successful. The most effective strategies seem to be those that combined multiple approaches: restricting supply through law enforcement, reducing demand through education and treatment, and addressing underlying social conditions that made drug use appealing. Finally, the story of 1920s Paris reminds us of the importance of social connection and meaning in preventing addiction. The lost generation came to Paris partly because they felt alienated from their home societies, cut off from traditional sources of meaning and purpose. Drugs offered belonging, a sense of transgressive community, and temporary escape from existential anxiety. Addressing addiction requires not just medical interventions or law enforcement, but rebuilding the social fabric that provides people with connection, purpose, and hope. The heroin craze of 1920s. Paris was a unique historical moment, shaped by specific circumstances that will never be exactly replicated. The aftermath of a catastrophic war, the concentration of artistic talent in one city, the particular legal and social environment of interwar France, all combined to create conditions for a drug epidemic. Yet the underlying dynamics, the human needs and vulnerabilities that made people susceptible to addiction, remain constant across time and place. The search for meaning, the desire to escape pain, the longing for transcendence, the susceptibility to promises of easy solutions to difficult problems. These are perennial aspects of human existence. Paris survived its heroin craze. The city endured, though scarred and changed. Many individuals did not survive, their lives cut short or diminished by addiction. Others recovered and went on to productive lives, though they carried the experience with them always. The story of heroin in 1920s. Paris is ultimately a very human story. It's about brilliant people making terrible choices, about medicine's promise perverted into poison, about a society struggling to come to terms with trauma and change, about the eternal tension between freedom and responsibility, pleasure and wisdom, art and life. As we close this chapter of history, we might reflect on what it teaches us about our own time. The specific drugs may change, the cultural context shifts, but the fundamental questions remain. How do we help people who are suffering? How do we balance individual liberty with collective well-being? How do we create societies where people feel connected, purposeful, and hopeful enough that they don't need to escape into chemical oblivion? These questions don't have easy answers. But understanding the past, including difficult and painful chapters like the heroin craze of 1920s Paris, helps us approach them with greater wisdom and compassion. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darker episodes. If you found this exploration valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this period of history or any topics you'd like to see covered in future videos. Until next time, sleep well and remember that even the darkest nights of history eventually give way to dawn.